Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Janet Hovath, a longtime cellist with the Minnesota Orchestra and the author of the memoir, The Cello Still Sings. We talk about the one question that started it all, growing up the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and the legacy that this story can leave on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Janet Horvath, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks.
I am very pleased to talk to you. You are the author of the new memoir, The Cello Still Sings. I guess before we get into a lot of your background, tell me a little bit about the book and how you decided to write this and why now with this book.
Well, that's an interesting question. My parents were Holocaust survivors, but both of them were also professional musicians. My father was a cellist in the Toronto Symphony for 38 years. My mother was a pianist and singer. And we were bringing music to people to transform lives. That was our goal always. You know, music can speak wordlessly to people and reach people's hearts, especially the cello, which they say is the closest sound to the human voice. So I had known that my parents suffered some grave, horrible injury. But like many first generation, like me, G2s, we call ourselves, my parents never spoke about their experiences. The Holocaust hovered over us, and somehow we gleaned something horrible had happened, and we received it through our genes. The actual specifics were never talked about until well into my adulthood. My father was starting to fade. He was 87, and I was driving him on a yucky, slushy January day to a doctor's appointment. I'd gone back and forth from Minneapolis to Toronto. My family grew up, my parents came to Toronto after the war, and we grew up there. And so here I was in Minnesota and going back and forth to try to ease their, aging process. And so I was driving my father, and he could be a difficult person to talk to in a day-to-day way, And so I thought, okay, he loves to talk shop. My father played with some of the greatest maestros in Europe, and he loved to talk about cello playing and music, but I never asked him this question of my favorite idol in the music world. So I said, Dad, did you ever play with Leonard Bernstein? And it was as if my father passed out. He put his hand to his cheek and his eyes rolled back into the back of his head. And I thought, yikes, what the heck? Should I pull over? I mean, what's going on? And I kept, driving, thinking, what should I do now? And suddenly he came to and he said, yes, it was a very hot day. It was in the displaced persons camps. And he was just a kid. And he came to Germany, to Landsberg, and he played Rhapsody in Blue. And it was just fantastic. And I talked to him and I told him, I want to come to America. And he said, no, you're a great Jewish musician. You should go to Palestine. And before I could get my tongue around the questions that were streaming through my head, such as, well, what were you doing in Germany? And how did you get a cello? And was my mother even there? And, all these questions, where did you get the strength to play after whatever you went through?
Right.
He shook his head and he huddled against the side of the car and he wouldn't talk anymore about it, or the memory left him.
Did you know, had you known that he was in a displaced persons camp, or was that statement alone news to you as well?
It was all news to me. I went running to Google that night after I got him settled, and I went to Leonard Bernstein's site, the great maestro who was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, who composed West Side Story, my great idol. And here was something I didn't know about him. He had been invited to conduct in the displaced persons camps. And it turned out that there was a printed program. So I found it on his website. I went and wrote to this museum, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. I said, my father was in this orchestra, and do you have the program? Could I come see it? And they wrote me right back and said, yes, Janet, please make an appointment the next time you're in New York. We'd love to show you the signed program in our archives, but don't you want to see the live video testimony and the photographs? That's when I started screaming.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So that year, the Minnesota Orchestra, when I was still in it, we were about to play a concert in Carnegie Hall. We traveled to New York in May of 2009. And I raced down to Battery Park. I had a 2-hour window before the rehearsal and the concert. And the archivist met me at the door. She put on long gloves, white gloves, and reached into this archival box and pulled out these teeny tiny 1948 black and white photos. And I said, there's my dad. There he is with a full head of hair and a mustache. And it turns out that my father played, I thought, in a large orchestra like a group that I played in.
Yeah.
17 Holocaust survivors, musicians, 17, who didn't play 2 concerts. My father played 2 with Leonard Bernstein, but it turns out that this group was bused all over Bavaria to the displaced persons camps in the American zone after the war. From 1946 to 1948, my father played 200 concerts. They were sent to bring morale-boosting programs to those still languishing in the displaced persons camps, waiting for news of loved ones, waiting for the right paperwork to leave Europe. And there were photographs of this. And I thought, this is a story that we don't know about how after the war, people somehow were able to gain some hope, figure out how to go on living, and that these programs were instrumental in helping people move on. Yeah.
I'm just speechless right now. That is, I mean, not only did he play these 200 shows around Bavaria, but he played for your idol, and you had this whole life and excellent career as a cellist, never knowing this piece of your history.
Right. Isn't it inexplicable? So, but
It seems like it should be, but at the same time, like you said at the start, your generation, one removed from the survivors, the children of survivors, you more often than not aren't getting the story sort of firsthand. They don't, from what I've heard anecdotally, you're very much like other people who get these stories either after their parents have passed away or much later in their lives because they either don't want to or can't bring themselves to tell the stories of what they've been through.
Exactly. I mean, they believed that they had to just look forward. My mother, especially, she never alluded to it. Whereas my father, of course, now I know that it was probably some PTSD, but my father would have the nightmares. He would sometimes choke or weep at night. And we knew other dads didn't cry like he did.
Mm-hmm.
So they, in a way, were trying to protect us. And at the same time, we as children gleaned through our genes that something horrible had happened. We tried to protect them. So we were the best behaved children. We were type A, trying to succeed in ways that they couldn't and live for those who didn't. And so it was this dual weird connection of accepting some kind of responsibility for it, but also having the trauma live through us.
Mm-hmm. I guess learning this information so obviously very late in your father's life, later in your life. How has that affected sort of the, I guess, 14 years since you first learned about it, or first saw the video and the pictures of your dad at that museum?
Well, it had an amazing result. I blew up the pictures to poster size and took them to Toronto to show my father. And I was nervous. Initially, I didn't know if he would be angry with me that I am bringing this up, or whether it would cause him further pain, which of course I didn't do. I didn't know how he would react, but I wanted to see if he might recognize some of the people who were as yet unidentified. And he unfurled the big poster and looked down, and I was holding my breath, and I thought, oh my gosh, what is going to happen? And then he looked up and he said, here is David Arban. He was Heim Arbeitsman, and his he changed his name to David Arbin, and he got into the Philadelphia Orchestra, and as if it had been his own personal accomplishment. So he was excited and enthusiastic and telling me things about it. And what eventually resulted was that I discovered also that there had been a documentary made about this orchestra, and that my father was in it in still pictures. And when we watched it, said, Dad, here you are. There was a close-up of him, and my father had this disconnect between seeing his younger self and also seeing his adult daughter. But he understood how much I wanted to know about it. And so he started scribbling late at night. We didn't know what he was doing. He could hardly write because he had severe Parkinson's by then, and it was a dark scrawl, but he wrote in Hungarian. And when I visited that year in August, he didn't meet me at the elevator with noisy smooches covering my face. The door was ajar. I walked in the apartment, and he's sitting very formally with this white paper that has dark scribbles all over it. And he says, I'm going to read you this. Janet came, my little Janet. I said, okay, what could it be? Insurance papers or something? I sat down, and he says, here, I'm going to read my testimony. And it was in Hungarian. He was speaking in Hungarian, and it was written in Hungarian. So I said, Dad, let me grab my computer just a second. And I started writing it. And my Hungarian is from a 10-year-old's perspective. It's pretty good, but
Yeah.
I didn't have the vocabulary for lynching poles, gravel pits, wheelbarrows. My father had been in slave labor in the copper mines of Bora, Yugoslavia, because he was a young man when the Nazis finally invaded Hungary in March of 1944, which was very, very late in the war. But this was the last remaining large Jewish population in Europe. And Adolf Eichmann went personally to Budapest to see to this last big community of Jews, despite the fact that they were already losing the war. So it happened extremely quickly in Hungary. And we discovered my father was on the last train that did not go to Auschwitz from Budapest. So he decided to write his testimony. And I started, trying to sound out the words. And I said, Dad, how do you spell that? He says, Janet came. Why are you interrupting me every second? So I knew that I better not. I sounded out the words to look up later. And he passed away 6 weeks later. So I got his entire story before he died, which was a blessing.
Absolutely. Were you able to get it fully translated? Does it all make sense? Like, did it all make sense as you wrote it, as he told it? Did it all connect?
Yes, totally. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's how I begin my book about that story with Leonard Bernstein, and stumbling on this accidentally, really.
Yeah.
I not asked that question. I may not have ever got the story. So I unravel my book like I unraveled it for myself. It reads like a mystery.
I mean, that's, it's amazing thing when you can take a memoir like that, but has an arc of a fiction novel. It can take that sort of, you know, mystery detective quality to it.
Yes, and I was very fortunate. Um, the ending was as if it was a gift to me. It was Beschert
Mm-hmm.
that my father played May 10th of 1948 in Landsberg with Leonard Bernstein. 70 years later, I got a call from Germany. I'm in a cafe and I can't even hardly hear this woman. And she's saying, Janet, I'm calling from Landsberg. We have to, like Germans like me, non-Jews, we have to teach the next generation. And would you do us the honor to come to Landsberg next year? We'll have a 70th anniversary and we'll try to replicate this concert. I'm going, well, I guess, might be nice, May in Munich, in 2018. And then she says, but it would mean so much. Please consider doing us the honor to play Kol Nidre for that concert. And I did. And I played
Whoa.
their German Youth Orchestra of Landsberg. And it was any typical junior high orchestra, and I was rehearsing with them and trying to get them to play it well and to understand the deep meaning of the piece to us, to Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
It was as if we left our bodies. It was a mind-boggling out-of-body experience where we all played better than we thought we could. And it was such a hopeful, reconciliatory evening that it brought the people together in ways that words don't always bring people together.
It's, I mean, a phenomenal way to find out all that you did, all that goes into this book. I mean, just complete happenstance that you asked that very simple question.
Right. And then I was able to jump off from that testimony from my father,
Yeah.
name places that he played, etc. And so I made a couple of pilgrimages to Europe, tracing where he'd played, where he grew up. And also I went to Munich, I went to Dachau, went to the places that I needed to go to learn more about their background and what happened to the Hungarian Jews, which isn't as well known as what happened in the rest of Europe.
Right.
I dug into archives where I went to the United States Holocaust Museum. They said, it happened so fast in Hungary. We don't have the documents that we have in Germany. I don't think we'll find anything. And the archivist is, whipping through microfilm. And then I see my father's signature, which I could recognize. And I said, there it is. Wait, go back. And there's a document of their incarceration
Mm-hmm.
and being in when they went to Munich and registrations and all that. I found tremendous things.
Stunning. Now that you know your parents' story and what they went through um, in Hungary and Europe at that time, how are there a lot of things through in your upbringing that sort of make sense now, like things that you didn't you thought were maybe unusual at the time, where it's like, oh yeah, now I get it, now I understand why, the mannerisms or things that they did.
Very much so. There are so many bafflings and anxieties that I have and that I grew up with that now makes sense. I mean, just a little example is that I was speaking to somebody else who was like me, a Holocaust child, and I said, my parents never let me sleep over at anybody's place. And she said, oh, I wasn't allowed sleepovers either. And we realized that families that were not together were separated forever when the Nazis walked in. So there were little things like that. But the other most important issue, I think is that my parents tried to instill in us never to say we were Jewish. Their world capsized. They were tremendously afraid that people would hate us for who we are and that it would happen again.
Mm.
And so I have to say that I still feel that in some ways. This book has been cathartic for me because now that I'm speaking publicly about these stories and sharing my parents' story, it's making me be public about who I am and my identity and feel that I should be more open about it and feel that I'm proud of who I am, proud of my legacy, and hope that it's a legacy for the future.
You mentioned being part of the Minnesota Orchestra trip to New York, which when you were first able to see those archive materials. You were the associate principal cello player for the Minnesota Orchestra you were there from 1980 to 2012. Clearly, music is, I mean, it's the family business.
Right.
Why the cello? Yeah, I mean, you mentioned your mom was a pianist also. What was it about the cello and sort of following in your dad's footsteps in that way that really appealed to you?
I'm not sure it was my choice. I'm a little person, and my parents realized I was talented when I started picking out the notes that my mother was teaching her young piano students, and I could play them by ear. And they thought, okay, imagine her coming out on stage in a long dress. It'll be so beautiful. It was unusual for a woman to play the cello at the time. And they never imagined that I was going to be tiny and that I'd have to be schlepping the bulky beast in and out of hotel rooms and up and down staircases and in and out of the car. So sometimes I would say to my mother, this is your fault. And she would say, no, you wanted it. You wanted it. So I believe that I really felt like I had to live for my father. And my father was very accomplished, but he never achieved, I think, the dreams that he had for himself. And I felt that I needed to. So I did become a cellist. And the thread through the book is also the vitally important piece, Kol Nidre. So my father played it for 30 years at Temple Sinai in Toronto, where we grew up. And then I started playing it here at Temple Israel, first at Temple Israel for 30 years. And so it's a thread throughout the book of this feeling like we need to consider our deeds of the past, what happened to the past, how we can move through the future and be better people and change the world to make it a better place. So the book, ending with Kol Nidre is kind of bringing it full circle.
Yeah.
Me.
This is not your first book, but it is definitely a departure. And you're a prolific writer, not just in books, but, articles, magazine pieces. But this book is obviously a very different. You've written on music and being a musician. Your first book was on injury prevention in musicians, which I'm sure is a big topic in that industry. This is, was it, how hard was it to sort of write something so personal and to dig so deep into your own family trauma so many years after it happened?
It was really daunting because as you said, I've written a lot, but I had no idea how I could put something of this scope together. It's 70 years of history.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to read, as you said, like a fiction book. It's compelling, it's storytelling. And I had to spread it out on our dining room table and all over the floor. And I'm thinking, how am I going to put this together? And so I went back to Hamline University and I got my MFA in creative writing when I left the orchestra. And I just needed the support and ideas of the, the writers among us. And I finally came upon the structure that I wanted to. So I have flashbacks to my childhood that go into first person so that I can do backstory and to make the history make sense. But music, of course, is a big thread, as is growing up with, the trials and tribulations of trying to get lessons and take auditions and have the, pleasures and the failures that happen when you're trying to become an excellent artist. So I think it has a lot of different threads in it, and I'm happy with how it turned out, really.
And as you mentioned, you're from Toronto. You've recently done a visit to Toronto to bring the book there. You have other book tours coming up, North Carolina later this summer. Most recently, you were back at Orchestra Hall doing a presentation of the book this past Thursday and Friday, June 8th and 9th. And coming up, you'll be doing there's a book event and presentation at Temple Israel on Friday, June 23rd. We'll have the link to that in the show notes. But when you go on the road with these events, when you take them to synagogues, what kind of what does a typical event look like for something like this?
Well, what has been incredibly heartening is that I have attended book club groups and where they have a sit down dinner and they try to make some of my mother's recipes. And there's that smaller intimate group. And then there's the larger groups like at Orchestra Hall, where I'll read some of the book and I'll speak about how I put the book together and some of the incidents that occurred and what affected me. I like to ask questions of the audience and have them ask questions of me. The most important thing for me has been the conversations afterwards. And I really want people to understand that statelessness and displacement are still with us. And I'm hoping that my book will help people understand what people might go through as refugees and have more empathy with them, and to perhaps understand that building empathy can happen with one conversation at a time with somebody that's not the same as you, to dispel fear, to dispel suspicion. And I just hope that my book might do that for people. What's been really what's been very heartening is that so many audience members so far have not been Jewish. And these people, some of them would never pick up a Holocaust book, but because of the music, it's a conduit into the story. And I'm hoping that people will learn something about a history that they may not be familiar with.
Well, I mean, that's as good a reason to pick up the book as any. Well, Janet, last couple of questions before we let you go. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I think my favorite Jewish holiday is Passover.
Okay.
Because it brings the family together. The foods are not only the ritual foods, but they're amazingly delicious. I make a fantastic Sephardic haroset that every year I think, you know what, I really should make this as an apple crisp, and I just don't, I make it for Passover. So I would say Passover, yeah.
And your favorite Jewish food? Is it that Sephardic croissant?
Oh, that would be hard. Well, are you talking sweet or savory? Because
Who am I to define what's your favorite?
yeah, well, there's obviously matzo ball soup,
Of course.
but there's chocolate babka, rugula, and
Yeah. I mean, so many good choices on both the sweet and the savory, but Those are good selections. Janet Horvath, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. The book is The Cello Still Sings. We will have the links to where you can buy the book, which is out and available at most, any fine bookseller in the area. And we'll have links to the upcoming events here in the Twin Cities. So you should go meet Janet and check the book out. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for everything.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.